today. I will be honest. I have a lot of love for this congregation, but there's one thing that you all do or don't do that absolutely drives me nuts. And it's when I ask for any sort of feedback, I only get one answer or zero when I'm trying to get 10 to 15. So, last week I asked if you would like me to try to do more of an overview of the Gospels, not cover every single word, or if you wanted me to just do everything. And I got one answer, and he knows who he is. And he told me to cover every single word. So if you had a different opinion, sorry, you didn't tell me. So we're covering every single word of every single gospel in the best order that I can figure it out. So I hope that's all right with you, but nobody said otherwise. I had one vote for extensive and no votes for anything else. So congratulations. That's exactly. Well, I wanted to, the only thing I was going to try to do in terms of like summary was, if it had 3 or 4 different accounts, I wasn't going to have us read every single one, but I think we're going to do that. What I have, I've actually got quite a few different resources that I'm using to try to put this together, but one of the main things I'm going to be using is this book right here, A Harmony of the Four Gospels, which I think my kids may have already bent the front cover, or I did, one of the two. I got this year, and all this is, for me at least, and you're welcome to look at this, by the way, afterwards if you'd like to, but it just tries to put all the verses in order. So it uses the NIV, which I will be using. I'll be putting on the PowerPoint, and I always use English Standard Version. But this uses the NIV, but what it does is it basically puts together in chronological order as best as possible and then starts doing parallel accounts as we get farther in. In the early part of the life of Jesus, we're not going to have too many parallel accounts, as we'll talk about a little bit this morning. But like even in here, it will parallel, like for example, this account here about John is paralleled in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so it puts all of these verses exactly next to each other and even tries to line up words and phrases together with each other. I'm not going to reproduce all of that on the PowerPoint because I think that's copyright infringement technically, but I'm going to try to put some of that up there. But I'm going to basically go through this book, and I'm going to cover it in order because like I said, it's just the gospel words, but it's just putting it together in order. And I'm going to try to cover everything, and I'm going to use this as a checklist for myself, actually, to make sure that we've covered everything. And what I would really like, and I tried asking you for input last week, and it didn't work, but what I'd really like to ask now is I'd really like to ask that as we go, if there's something that I can cover in a better way, cover in a different way, something that I don't explain sufficiently enough for you. I joke about this. I say all the time, I assume that means I explained it perfectly. You've heard me say that a million times. I know I say that too many times probably. I don't actually believe that. I just believe that you all aren't speaking up when it comes to that. And so if you have something that you want me to rehash, rediscuss, try again, you're not going to offend me. It doesn't have to do with you're stupid and I'm smart, or I can't explain it and you're not able to comprehend it. It just has to do with the way I explain things may not be the way that you learn them perfectly. Or the way that I think that I'm explaining it may not make sense to you. That's totally fine. That doesn't mean either one of us has done a bad job, and it doesn't mean that either one of us is incompetent. All it means is I need to try again, or I need to try to point you to some other resource that can help you understand it, because these are the words and the life and the actions that we have recorded of Jesus. Jesus is the core of our faith. He is the foundation of our faith. And I love all the other things in the Scripture as well, but this is absolutely essential that we have a great and complete, as much as possible, understanding of these passages. And so please be willing to talk to me and tell me what I can do better, or what I can try explaining again, or what you didn't understand that I can try to help you with. Because I will, if I don't get any of that, I'll just feel like that y'all are not really listening, or I'm not really doing a good job. And so the more feedback on this, the better. We are going to start with, when it comes to actual text this morning, and like I said, I ask you to give me a few weeks for us to find a good flow on how this is all going to work. But we're actually going to start this morning with Luke chapter 1. In Luke chapter 1, and I'm not, like I said, my goal is not really to talk about the Gospels as individual books, but I will just remind you this morning that Luke and Acts are obviously both written by Luke, and it seems as if you look at this, that he is writing these Gospels, or this Gospel and the book of Acts, to a man named Theophilus. Now, Theophilus, the Greek word, just means lover of God. And so it is possible that he's just saying, I'm writing to you who are a lover of God. And so the question you ask yourself, do you love God? The answer is yes, I hope so. And so maybe Luke is just kind of using that as a way of saying, hey, I'm writing this book to you. And so it could be a real person, it could be the other, it could be both at the same time. But this is what Luke says that the purpose of his gospel account is. He says, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. And one of a few things that I think are interesting from this passage that are going to be helpful to remember is, I absolutely believe, and I have no problem with stating, I think that there were probably more gospel accounts than the 4 that we have saved for us today. I very much believe that. I think that there was probably a lot more gospel accounts, a lot more people writing letters, just as you can think of all the times that you've either shared the gospel or heard people share the gospel with you. In a similar way, I think in that time there was a lot more of these gospel accounts, and I'm not saying that any of them necessarily were untrue. It's even possible, it's even quite possible, that many of these other gospel accounts were possibly inspired by the Holy Spirit as well. However, when it comes to the 4 that we have, these are the 4 that God chose to preserve. That doesn't mean that there wasn't more, but these are the 4 that God chose to preserve. It doesn't mean that the other ones were not helpful in any way, in their time and in their purpose and in their place, but they were not necessarily needed to preserve, possibly because they were just another repetition of what had already been written. But I want you to keep in mind that there were so many apostles, there were so many people, eyewitnesses of Jesus, so many people who saw him. Think about all the people that could possibly have written or told the gospel story from an eyewitness perspective. And I think it's interesting to think about. Now, that does not mean that I'm suggesting to you this morning that a lot of these fake gospels that you're going to go on the internet and find, or you're going to see pop up on TV, are correct. If it contradicts the narrative of what we're given here, then that means it's not correct. So there's a lot of gospel accounts, like the Gospel of Thomas comes to mind. There's a Gospel of Judas. And they are old books. They are books from 200 to 300 years after the life of Jesus, but that does not mean that they were correct. Just because they're old does not mean that they are accurate. There was people lying about Jesus while he was alive. And so what makes you think people weren't writing books lying about Jesus immediately after he died? And so Yeah, there's more gospel accounts. But Luke says, I decided to try to write for Theophilus so that he would have certainty. And so the things that are written here for us, not just in Luke, but all four of the Gospels, I think are written so that we may have certainty about Jesus. And so God has picked these four accounts to tell us what we need to know about the life of Jesus so that we can have confidence and we can be secure and we can put our head on the pillow at night knowing that the things that we were taught about Jesus were true. And that's the first four verses that we're going to cover together. Any questions or comments on that before we move on? I need to get a button for this remote that just plays the Jeopardy music. And every time you guys give me that silent treatment, I'm just going to start playing the Jeopardy music at y'all. I think the next appropriate place to go to when we're really talking about the life of Jesus, honestly, and you know what, I might do this in a sermon series later, but to talk about the life of Jesus that we know about, I think we'd have to go back to Genesis chapter 1. Because God says, let us make man in our image, which many people believe correctly so is a reference to the triune nature of God, the Trinity. And so Jesus is there. There is a belief, and I have not studied it extensively, but there is a belief that the angel of the Lord, oftentimes, that is talked about throughout the Old Testament in different cases, is capitalized in your English Bibles because it is given a presence and a sense to it in Hebrew. And people think that might be a title that is Jesus coming to do work in other forms or fashions. Because again, angel, the word angel really just means messenger. And so Jesus, of course, he's God, but when he's on this earth, right, he's acting as a messenger. And so we may spend some time in a sermon or some other looking through the Old Testament at different references that are possibly to Jesus. But I think we have to understand and acknowledge that before Jesus was born, Jesus existed because he is God. And so one of the things that I want us to kind of think in the back of our mind and kind of keep as we look through this gospel story, this beautiful story, is trying to understand the difference between Jesus' spiritual nature and his physical nature, right? Because he was fully God and fully human. How is that possible? I don't know, because it is something that has not happened before and has not happened since Jesus. Jesus is unique in that way. And so we'll kind of talk about that and look at some references to that as we go. But I think John, the Gospel of John, the first section here, really speaks to this idea about Jesus existing even before he was born. Now, John does not have a birth account of Jesus. And really, as Kurt pointed out a few weeks ago in talking about Mark, neither does Mark either. Mark launches straight into the action of Jesus. John launches right after this straight into John the Baptist. We're going to be spending the rest of our time this morning in Matthew and Luke, and we're going to be spending the next few weeks in Matthew and Luke because they're the ones that detail really the birth of Jesus, the birth of John the Baptist, all these events that I think many people are somewhat familiar with because they believe it is the Christmas story, right? And so a lot of people are familiar with these events. But this passage here really speaks to the nature of Jesus before he was ever born. And so I want to just spend a few moments looking at this together. We're going to look at verse 1 through 18. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe in him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Verse 15 has these parentheses here, and we'll come back to this when we start talking about John's ministry. But it says here that John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.' For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, God the only Son, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." And so what's interesting here is we see, I'm struggling with this because I could spend the next month and a half on those 18 verses, right? Or I could try to condense it into the next 20 minutes. And it's hard for me to decide what to do here. But at the same time, I think we see here that there is this nature of talking about Jesus that shows his pre-existence and his purpose and his future all at the same time. There's these words, and this is one of the things I was trying to emphasize, I think, with the kids at our day camp last year in talking about Jesus and talking about creation, is that you've got the Word and you've got light and life. And in Genesis chapter 1, in creation, all three of these things are connected, which is why I believe so fervently that Jesus is meant to be there in our minds at the creation of God. Because you have the Word was life, life was light, light shines in the darkness. To me, it's such a clear reference when you think about the very first thing that was created was light, right? Not, and I think this is important, not the sun, the moon, and the stars, the things we think of as giving us light, right? What day was that created on? 4th. Elizabeth knows this really well because she sings the Days of Creation song with the kids. If you haven't sang the Days of Creation song in a while, I might make us all do it if you can't remember it. But that day 4, sun and moon and stars galore, those are the things we think of as giving us light, but yet we are told on day 1, God created light. Because all the things that were going to come after it needed light to live. You think about day 5 and 6, you have all these animals. Day 5 is birds and the fish. Day 6 is the animals on land. They all need what to survive? They need plant life to eat. And even if they were predators or carnivores, they still have to eat those that are eating the plants. All right, so what do the plants need to live? They need light, right? And so the plants were created on day 3. A place for the plants to grow was created on day 2. And the way for the plants to grow through water was created on day 2. And then on day 1, you have light, the very core of what they need. And I think it's so cool, this process by which the sun shines down on the plants, right? This cycle of life where the sun shines down on the plants, and the plants use photosynthesis to be able to take that and convert that into energy, and they use the nutrients in the soil and the water, and it helps them grow, and it helps them bring life. But then the animals eat that, and then the animals, their bodies create fertilizer, and their bodies themselves can become fertilizer, and it helps bring this cycle. It just keeps going and going and going. But all of it is centered around light. You take light out of the equation, it all dies. And so light is very much life. But where did the light come from? Where did the light come from on day one? God. But how did God create light? His voice and His words, right? And that's exactly what you're being told here at the beginning of John, was the Word was with God. All things were made through Him. He was life and light. To me, it's such a clear reference to creation. I can't get over that or around that. But then you have this idea of the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about that phrase is John's going to tell you in a few chapters after that the light, Jesus, got killed and destroyed by the world. Right? But he makes this claim right at the very beginning. The darkness did not overcome it. The darkness may have thought it overcame it when it killed Jesus, but it did not. And so right at the very core, and we're going to talk about this just a little bit more when we come back to the work of John, because I find it funny that John the Apostle is talking about John the Baptist here. But there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He's not talking about himself. He's talking about John the Baptist. But he says that he came to bear witness about the light. And so it launches into John's ministry. So I'm going to skip past that section, just knowing that the purpose of the beginning of John's ministry was to bear witness about the light, to bear witness about the coming light. This is the other thing, though. I want to make sure that we're over here. True light was coming into the world. He was in the world. The world was made through him. The world did not know him. So one of the main purposes of Jesus coming into this world was to make himself known to us. Because you have there at the end of this passage, no one has ever seen God. No one has seen God, but Jesus is the one. He has made him known. But there you go back in verse 10. The world did not know him, but he is making himself known. And then you really get a summation of Jesus' life, right? He came to his own, talking about the Jewish people, but also at the same time, I think it's just talking about people in general. The point is made throughout the scriptures, and we will see this as we go, that Jesus specifically focuses his ministry to the Jewish people, as was the promise of God and the purpose, but they rejected him. Jesus talks about it in parables. He talks about it plainly, and that's the reason the Pharisees, we think that they're so dumb for not listening to Jesus. They're pretty smart. They know exactly what he's saying, even when he conceals that in a parable. The Pharisees still know what Jesus is saying, enough that they understand that he is accusing them of this, and that's why they get so angry. But at the same time, I don't think John is just talking about Jesus came to the Jewish people and they killed him. I think he's talking about Jesus came to his own creation, right? We're talking about this idea of Jesus being at creation, of Jesus being the core and foundation of creation. He came into his own creation. One of the funniest things to me, or one of the interesting things, I love looking at fish tanks. Have you ever been to like Wonders of Wildlife over in Springfield, or any of the Bass Pro locations, and they've got all these super awesomely maintained? There was a guy at our church growing up who used to work for them, and he got the homeschool kids a tour, and we got to go behind the scenes and see some of how they do that. I've looked into doing that because I think that'd be really cool to have in my house, but it's incredibly expensive and complicated to make sure you have everything balanced perfectly. But you've got this aquarium that is balanced perfectly, that you've spent this time making sure it's got the right nutrients, the right amount of plants, the right amount of fish. And you got to make sure the fish like each other and they're not a variety that's going to eat each other, because then all your fish you just bought are going to eat each other. There's so many things to take care of, but at the same time, you never get to go into the aquarium and enjoy it. I know that sounds silly, but unless you put on a snorkel and stick your head in, you're doing it for something else, right? You're doing all this work for these creatures that live in there, and you don't ever get to enjoy it firsthand. And one of the interesting things here is it does present Jesus as, hey, Jesus is actually coming into his own creation here. He's not just watching as it is an aquarium. He's not just watching and looking in the back, and saying, hey, this is my thing. This is what I made. It's cool. Look at it. He's going in to experience it. And so this is this idea here that he's coming into the world. He was in the world. The world was made through him. But the world doesn't know him. I personally think, contrary to what the movie Finding Nemo might teach you, that the fish probably don't pay too much attention to what's outside the aquarium. They just know that either like a hand or a little net or whatever comes in every once in a while. They don't really know their sustainer of life, the one who created this aquarium for them. They don't really know us. They don't hang out with us. We don't pet them really as much. And I might be wrong about that, but that's kind of the idea I want you to think about here, is that they don't really know us. They don't really know what we look like, or they don't hang out with us. We don't talk to them, and they talk to us. And so this idea here is Jesus is coming in to make sure that he is known to his creation. He came to his own creation, but ultimately they're not going to receive him. However, some will. And so the promise is given here that those who believe in his name, he will give them the right to become children of God. We talked about this verse just a little bit in Revelation chapter 20. You remember in talking about the reign of Christians currently at this moment, we're reigning with God because we are God's children, right? And if God is a king, if you have a king, his children are princes and princesses, right? And so we are reigning with God currently over death, according to Revelation chapter 20. And so this is part of that promise. He came into the world to give us the ability to receive him so that we can reign with him, so that we can walk with him and be with him, and we can be reborn, not of blood nor of the will of the flesh, but of the will of man and of God. Now, I will fully admit, and I just want you guys to understand this right off the bat, one of the drawbacks of the way that we're going to be studying the life of Jesus is that I won't be able to connect together John like it should be. Because this chapter and these phrases are so clearly connected to John 3:16, right? Of this idea of Jesus and Nicodemus's conversation of how are you going to be born? How is a man supposed to be born again? These verses are so clearly connected to that. And because of the way we're going to be studying the life of Jesus, I won't be able to really talk about that and make that connection for you. But I just want to remind you of that because I think that that's so clear. That's why I like, as God has given it to us, I like looking at the Gospels individually, but I also like this idea of looking at the life of Christ as a whole. We're going to be able to see some different things maybe that we haven't seen before, but we're also not going to get to talk about some of the very clear connections between the verses because we're not going to be going in order of John 1, John 2, John 3, John 4, John 5. We're going to be jumping around. And so I just want you to keep in mind as we go through these things, just try to remember some of the lessons that you've heard, the things that you've been taught throughout your life, and remember these connections because they're not going to be ones that we get to focus on, at least for the purpose and the scope of our study. I think this is all I want to say about this passage for today. At least for the part of the introduction, the scope of what we're doing. Does anybody have any questions, comments, things they want to add, things they want to talk about more? Adam. Yeah. And they still
Me, myself, when I'm talking to people, I remember this, and I'm like, well, we're working post this, and we have all of it in front of us to be able to show them, but not to get too discouraged because the people that actually lived with him rejected him.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of preachers say, and I think it's appropriate to say, I sometimes I get mad or whatever if you guys seem like you don't listen to my lesson or whatever. I get frustrated a little bit, but Jesus is a much better preacher than I am, and he's talking to the apostles, and they don't get it 90% of the time, right? And so why do I have the right? If I am thinking in that way, then I am thinking I'm better than Jesus. I'm such a good preacher, y'all should listen to me. And so I've been trying to make sure and knock myself in the head when I do that. And a select few of you are welcome to help me by knocking me in the head if you feel like I'm doing that. But at the same time, we got to understand, not only did his apostles not understand things when he sat down with them one-on-one and explained it to them, but the people who were supposedly waiting for a Savior, looking for a Savior, the whole, the religious leaders, the ones who were spending all their time in the Scriptures, they just flat out rejected Jesus. And so Jesus is the best preacher, best teacher, best evangelist, best everything to have ever lived, and he still had a success rate of less than 10%, I would guess, probably even less than that. So few people followed him, and so, we're going to come on this phrase, we're going to come on this teaching of Jesus, wide is the gate, broad is the way that leads to destruction. We have to remember, we want to be in the majority. I think that's something that as humans, it's just a natural instinct. We want to be in the majority, but we're never going to be in the majority. We are never going to truly be in the majority, ever. And that's okay, because Jesus did his best work when he was in the minority. Anything else anybody wants to add on this passage? Yeah, you say that, and I keep encouraging you to get your ears checked. So, all right. Well, I have a couple more passages for us to look at this morning in our time together before we close, and they're the fun ones. You guys ready for this? Welcome to the genealogies, everyone. There are 2 genealogies. We are not going to talk about every single person because not every single person has something written about them. But because of what we're doing in our study, I am going to attempt to this morning. I'm going to attempt to wow you and impress you with my pronunciation of all these beautiful names. And we're going to read it. And so that way we can say that we have read everything in the Gospels in this class. And we can also look at a few of the lessons, and there's probably many that I will have missed in here, but the few of the lessons that I think are important from these 2 genealogies. So buckle up. Y'all ready for this? Matthew chapter 1. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, obviously, real quick, David is not Abraham's actual son, right? I think it's important, it's interesting here. He just picks out 2 of the highlights here. Matthew does. And a part of the purpose of that is because he's trying to show specifically how Jesus is descended from these 2 characters. And so this genealogy actually starts with Abraham. We're going to contrast that with the genealogy, the book of Luke. I'll just go ahead and say this. The book of Luke, the genealogy is inverted. It goes backwards from Joseph on up to Adam. And so it actually goes longer than the one in Matthew does. But it goes in reverse order. And so it counts backwards while this one starts at the back starts in the past and goes forward. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. But Jesus is of the tribe of Judah, right? Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Ruth the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel the father of Abud, that one I'm not sure on, Abiad, and Abiad the father of Elikim, and Elikim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliad, and Eliad the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Matan, and Matan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ 14 generations. Please hold your applause till the end. I want to point out a few of these people specifically as we go through here. I think it's really interesting. Basically, and I want to make sure I say this correctly, every time a woman is mentioned, it's because there's sin involved. But it is not the woman's fault most of the time or every time, okay? I just want to make that clear, all right? But every time a woman is mentioned, it's because there's sin involved. Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Anybody remember that lovely story? Tamar is Judah's daughter-in-law who disguised herself as a prostitute, and Judah paid to sleep with her because Judah would not give her another one of his sons to be her wife, or to be her husband. Very, very weird story. Very sinful story. But what's interesting in that is the book of Genesis actually portrays her as being the more righteous of the pairing of the two. Then you have, as you go on farther down, the father of Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. Now, the only reason anybody can think of, and in fact I think the only Rahab mentioned by name, is the one who is the harlot, right? Now, it does appear, according to the book of Joshua, that she would have proselytized or converted to being an Israelite. And so there's probably not a sin involved of Salmon here. He was not at fault for marrying her, but it is interesting that her past is one of sexual immorality. Then you have, and this I think is so cool because Boaz is one of my favorite characters in the Bible. He is the older man who married Ruth, the Moabitess. Ruth should not have been married to one of Naomi's sons in the first place because they should have never even been there in the first place, right? Remember that Naomi and her husband and sons left Israel to go live in the land of Moab because of famine. They should not have left in the first place. They were not supposed to abandon the land of their fathers, and yet they did. They were not supposed to take Moabite wives, and yet they did. However, it appears that by the time Naomi and Ruth comes back, that whole thing about your people will be my people, your God will be my God, she is proselytizing and converting to become an Israelite. And that is something that was allowed to happen, and I think that that's really cool. And so I don't think Boaz is at fault here, but again, Ruth, another woman with a checkered past here. Now, it is interesting to me, David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. They throw that one in. David is the most righteous one almost out of that entire list as far as we're aware, right? He's the man after God's own heart. But Matthew chooses to remind you that the only reason that Solomon existed was because David decided to not go out and lead his men in war like he used to. He decided to stay at home and look at naked women bathing on fellow rooftops. Now, and you can make the case, people like to make the case either way. You know, he coerced her, she's not at fault. I would just say this, I think David is the one who's portrayed as having the most fault, but I'm pretty sure Bathsheba should not have been bathing on a roof while her husband was not around. Or period, but you understand what I mean. She's out there exposing herself while her husband is off at war, right? I think there's fault on both sides. You could probably make a case pretty easily for David having the greater one, but I don't think you can make the case that she's innocent. And so here's another time with a checkered past. And yet, God, through all of these sins and through all of these struggles and through all of these problems, brings Jesus through this line. The only other woman that is mentioned by name is Mary. Mary is the one, and I got to be careful how I say this for our Catholic friends who may be watching. Mary was not sinless, but she did not conceive Jesus in sin either, right? The circumstances of her pregnancy were not sinful at all, but were incredibly unique, never having been done before, and never to be repeated. That doesn't mean she was without sin, so the only one that was really mentioned here was a woman who had the appearance of sin. And so I think it's interesting here that all of the women that are mentioned here are women who either had the appearance of sin or did have sin in their life, but who were redeemed by God's grace. The story of Rahab, in fact, was actually one of my first sermons that I gave when I was doing leadership training for Christ as a little kid. And so that story's always stuck with me. I love that story. I love the story of Ruth and Boaz. And so these stories about these women really stick out to me. And so I think it's interesting that Matthew also chooses to highlight them as well. Just a couple more things I want to mention, and we'll read the Luke genealogy. Next week, if you look chronologically, it says after the deportation to Babylon, there is a guy named Zerubbabel who pops up. I am not sure if it's the same Zerubbabel that was involved with rebuilding the temple, but chronologically and according to the tribe, it would absolutely match. And so I think it's highly probable that that's the same Zerubbabel that helped to rebuild the temple in and around 517 BC. The only other one I wanted